Hey guys, it's Dave. Thank you for tuning in as always. Today, before we dive into the video topic, I do just need to quickly thank a few new channel members for joining the team. We have Richard Starson, Roger Wilco, Barb's Used Cars, I guess if you need a used car, and Randy Kames. Thank you guys so much for joining. It's much appreciated. We also did have RS Graham a little while ago, so yeah, thanks as well. I think there was a few I missed while I was off on vacation. Okay, with that out of the way, today is another Rocket Lab video. We're going to listen to a couple recent interviews and conferences that Adam Spice, Rocket Lab's Chief Financial Officer, spoke at, see if there's anything interesting or of note that we can learn from these things, and I'll give you my reaction in real time. One of the conferences is a little over a week old now, so you may have already heard it, but if you didn't, it was from a Morgan Stanley conference. The other one is quite new. It's a Deutsche Bank interview on their podcast, so I'll be sure to share the full links to both of those down below in case you want to check out the full interviews. I'll just be kind of cutting this into what I consider to be the highlights. These videos do tend to run a little bit long though, so I hope you're ready for a longer one. Please do consider hitting subscribe if you haven't already and you find my videos useful. And if you're already a subscriber, I'll check out your thoughts on these conferences down below and continue the discussion there. All right, let's dive into Adam Spice's recent comments around Rocket Lab.
I would say the demand environment is right now we obviously have greatest visibility in the small dedicated launch side of the market, where Electron is the leading small dedicated launcher. We've launched it 52 times. We've got another launch coming up on the 17th. So they seem to be coming at a pretty good clip now. And Electron's a phenomenal vehicle. It allowed affordable small dedicated launch, whereas before Electron came along, probably the closest kind of analog to Electron would have been a Minotaur or Pegasus launch from Northrop Grumman, which would run you $40 to $50 million. That didn't fly very often. Now you can get an Electron launch for around $8 million, depending on kind of what your needs are. But that's our backlog right now is priced around $8.2 million. And if you wanted to do something on, for example, on a Falcon 9, you'd put.
Figured I'd just quickly pause there. That's probably a pretty key point, saying backlog is now priced around $8.2 million. So that's a number to keep in mind for the financial models in the spreadsheets, which I do need to update my spreadsheets again soon and update you guys on that. But I think for new signings now, I have to assume more like an 8.2 million ASP, average selling price, whereas it used to be more like 7.5.
And so for cadence, how high in volume could Electron go?
Well, we originally scaled our factories to do, a rocket, like a launch per week. So we have the footprint to be able to do 50 launches per year. We can launch 128 times out of New Zealand alone, right? We have launch pad, New Zealand, plus we have launch facilities in Wallops Island, Virginia. So look, I don't think that we're going to be the limiting factor right now. Right, we see, demand. It's not hard to squint and see 20 plus, 30 plus launches per year. Right now, we really don't see the demand for kind of 50 launches, so we didn't think that we're not facilities limited. It's really kind of the market demand.
Just interesting to hear the numbers mentioned for Electron. Yeah, I wasn't really holding my breath on 50 launches a year anytime soon, but even 24 should give them a solid, profitable gross margin. We're already looking at gross margin profitability at the kind of this year. The numbers we're doing should be like 16, 17. Once you get into the mid-20s, that's when things are looking really good. And he does see it going there, even into the low 30s maybe, which would be even better, because the higher the cadence, the better the margins will be.
On GAAP and GAAP gross margins were pretty close, actually. Call it in the low 30s. And we see a path, which is consistent. We talked about this when we came public, that we could see that being a 45 to 50 point gross margin business, right? And for us, I'd say cash margin is pretty similar. Like the only thing that we really have in our model that's a little bit different is so we do have reasonable depreciation and amortization and a little bit of stock-based comp in the mix as well. But I think that's a product line that once we get to 2 launches per month, that's the sweet spot where we really can get focus on that kind of north of 40 points of gross margin contribution from that product line. And there's really not a lot of R&D going to that anymore, so a lot of that just flows to the bottom line.
And Adam, do you need a reusability to be on the first stage to be a factor to get to that higher gross margin, or is this just volume and cost efficiency of manufacturing?
I think we can get there without reusability now. I had my doubts before, but I think now, if we were to get to a consistent cadence where we're launching, if you're in the 30 launches per year range, I think pretty safely we could get there without reusability. Reusability just kind of gives you an extra buffer. And what does that translate into? I think reusability probably adds, maybe around, 500 basis points of margin improvement once we get that kind of dialed in, because you can't do reusability on every launch, right? It depends on the trajectories, right? How far offshore are you going? What's the payload requirement for the rocket? Because the recovery equipment actually consumes some of the mass throw capability of the rocket, about 40 kgs worth.
I actually find that pretty surprising, guys. I'm not going to lie. The fact that he sees Electron reusability improving gross margins by about 5% or 500 basis points, that's not a lot. A while back, I made a video building out a spreadsheet going over, Electron profitability, I thought they would get to those margins, how much money they'd eventually be making. And in my numbers, I pretty sure I thought that reuse would save them more than that or improve their margins by more than that. So that means I really have to rethink things on that model, but it also makes me wonder, how much is it really worth it for a 5% improvement? Talking about all the R&D, which I guess is mostly done, a lot of work, people that could be working on something else like Neutron. I don't know. Maybe they back off completely from reusability at some point and just decide it's not worth it for 5%. I don't know. That's a really interesting one. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Especially, I want to talk to Scott about this because me and Scott did a video discussing the economics of Electron reusability. So I feel like this probably surprises him as well because we did quite a deep dive on that.
Yeah, no, I'm confident that we're going to get to margins north of 40 points once we get the cadence up to at least, again, 2 rockets per month is kind of where we kind of get there. The recovery was interesting because, nothing involving helicopters is straightforward. Right? Or cheap. Yeah, helicopters are very expensive. I would say that, we just figured out that we'll have a higher percentage of launches that can be recovered if we're using marine recovery, because you can go further offshore. You have limitations with a helicopter, how far you can go before you got to run out of fuel and come back.
Just to interrupt once again, doing some quick math in my head on this on recovery now. Let's say you have 20, just for a round number, hopefully it'll be higher, but let's say you have 20 launches in a year. Each launch now going for about $8 million for a round number. So that means we're talking about $160 million in revenue, right? What's 5% of that now? Like $8 million? So we're talking all this work on Electron for $8 million for reuse? Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, the future of reusability, and it really makes a lot of sense why they shifted all their resources to work on Neutron right now. Hearing that number, I'm totally on board with not working on reusability and instead working on Electron reusability, that is. Yeah, it's still processing. That number is still percolating here.
One thing we've done, and Pete's very consistent in when he has a vision of how you actually put that vision into action. It's a lot of very practical steps along the way, and he's very, very disciplined in that way. In that he said, look, I want to basically every program that I take on with a customer, not only do I want it to make money for the company, but it has to teach us something along the way that ultimately we're going to put to use for ourselves in putting our own assets on orbit and creating recurring revenue streams from that. Because ultimately, our vision for Rocket Lab really doesn't look all that dissimilar to the SpaceX vision of a super capable, reusable launch vehicle with an application that you support with it. So certainly Neutron is going to be used to deploy other people's payloads, but a big piece of that vision is to deploy our own payloads.
I love that philosophy, by the way, of picking missions to do not only, to get paid for them, which I know Rocket Lab needs to do and does get paid, but every time they pick a new mission, they're building out a new capability, whether it's the Varda and learning about these capsules and reentry, or the Global Star constellation is for Apple's SOS network for their iPhone. So now we're talking about direct to mobile communications. And yeah, they just keep learning and improving on different functionalities. So very interesting to see. I mean, SpaceX's valuation, obviously, if Rocket Lab gets to even 1/10 of that, as investors, we're laughing all the way to the bank. So when he says it's not dissimilar to SpaceX, I find that very exciting.
Ultimately, all of these things breadcrumb our way into creating an IP portfolio that when we have Neutron, that ultimately is the key to unlocking a constellation opportunity for us, that we'll be able to build the most sophisticated spacecraft in a very vertically integrated way and deploy those spacecraft super efficiently on our own vehicle. That sounds a lot like SpaceX's model, right? It is.
It just sounds very exciting. Just the way he says it, too. It excites me for the future of Rocket Lab.
Starlink wouldn't be, in my opinion, wouldn't be what it is today if they didn't have a reusable Falcon 9, right?
Yeah.
So all eyes are on Neutron, which is the appropriate place for them to be. Once that vehicle's in place, then I think the aperture of opportunities from a constellation perspective become much more clear.
So it seems like, mid next year, once Neutron's launching, I mean, we should hear from you more about what that constellation vision could look like.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a completely organic greenfield opportunity, right? I think as a public company, we have a currency, we have the ability to bring value to constellations out there. If you can imagine, like, if you're a constellation operator, you got a lot of things to do. You've got to have somebody design a spacecraft for you, or you design it. And then you have to have somebody make it for you, and they have to worry about all the supply chain complexity. Then you have to go procure launch. Then you have to operate the satellite in orbit with all the ground station needs and so forth. And then you got to basically manage and analyze the data and deliver that to the end customer. At the end of the day, if you look at what we can provide, is we can come in and say, well, tell you what, we can design a spacecraft, we can build a spacecraft, we can provide unfettered launch for those spacecraft, we can operate them on orbit, which allows the constellation to really do what they do best, which is manage the data and the customer, right? So I think when people think of like, well, everything we do might necessarily have to be organic, I don't think that's the case. I think there could be ample opportunities for inorganic growth and expansion into the applications market, through inorganic ways.
Thanks, Adam. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if there are any.
Unfortunately, we don't have the audience questions, but yeah, that was fascinating at the end. The way he described it sounded a lot more like a partnership than acquisitions, although I guess it could be an acquisition when you say inorganic, but fascinating big picture stuff there at the end of this interview for sure. So some fascinating stuff from Morgan Stanley. If you want to check out the full interview, I'll make sure to post that link down below in the description. Now on to the Deutsche Bank making sense of space.
Sure. And by the way, even in as short a time as since our statistics came out, so we're now at over 2,000 employees since we reported the 1,700 previously. So we're growing very rapidly, which is exciting. A lot of cool stuff I'm sure we'll get into.
Wow, over 2,000 employees now. That's a big company when you think about it. It's not really the small player it used to be not so long ago.
This really stands on its own as far as level of complexity, and the ecosystem is very, very unique. So, but I would say that that's all part of, why I wanted to do this. I wanted to do a couple things. I wanted to kind of get out of semis and really kind of be part of what the next huge growth opportunity for mankind was, which was really space, and then also have the opportunity to build a company and take it public, which fortunately we were able to do. So I think I've checked all the boxes, other than the fact that I've got a much higher aspirational, market cap, kind of target for Rocket Lab than we currently experience. But
that's nice to hear Adam just say outright. Yeah, he believes Rocket Lab's market cap can be much higher and aspires for it to be. It's pretty exciting for shareholders because obviously, nobody knows the business better than him except Peter.
If we're going to build these very complex space systems, we need to own all of the real critical subsystems that go into those. And so that's why we acquired, we acquired Sinclair Interplanetary about almost 4 years ago now. We acquired, the reaction wheels and the star trackers and the sun centers and sun sensors and torque rods. And then we bought Solero to pick up the solar capacity. And we picked up PSC for separation systems and ASI for the command and control software. And then we developed a bunch of other things that normally people would outsource, but we basically kind of insourced and vertically integrated around. So Pete's been very, very disciplined on basically identifying where other people can screw us over and basically take that off the table.
You love to hear it, and it's so blunt. Yeah, other people can screw us over here, so we're doing it ourselves. We don't want to have to rely on anybody else who could fail.
Well, I think with things like launch cadence, I think it comes down to communication, right? I think we've been very open since we came public as a company, say, look, launch is lumpy, right? I don't know if I can count the number of times I said lumpy, right, on quarterly calls and investor meetings and so forth. So you just got to condition your investors to realize that it's lumpy, and that as long as your backlog is solid, it's more of a timing issue than it is will it happen. I think the other thing that you can do, and we do, is we look to where we can.
That is true to an extent, yes. When the backlog grows, it's great, and you see it growing. But earnings does move stocks. So, yeah, the revenue recognition is important. Luckily, more and more of that is coming from the space system side now, which is quite regular. But we still need the actual launches to grow to 18, 20, 24 per year, not just backlog continuing to grow.
And so I think you had a lot of promotional folks that just said, hey, everyone's talking about how much money you can raise in space and start a cool rocket company. In reality, there's very few people on this planet that can really execute a real rocket development program. In fact, if you look, you can count on both hands how many entities in history have done it, including governments, right? Yep. So I think there was just this fluffy promotionalist opportunity for people to go raise a bunch of money, and then we saw what happened with that. Like if you've seen Wild Wild Space, the documentary on HBO, where you have, I think there's a pretty good example of one of those in there, right? And I think that
poor Astra, always getting poked fun at. But you know what? They burned a lot of investor money. So many retail investors got burned on them. So yeah, I can't feel too sorry for them.
So it's just really tough on almost every aspect. But the great thing is once you figured it out and you cracked the nut, then you've got a fairly protected area. Like to your earlier point, this market has not commoditized. We don't believe it's going to commoditize because, again, there's very few people that can actually pull this off. And I think the window for raising the amount of capital that was necessary to let you try has closed. Yep. So I think the launch companies that you see today are probably the launch companies you're going to see in the future at most.
That's fascinating, actually, and something I haven't thought a lot about. But if we look at the current players, and the funding environment has softened considerably. I know interest rates are falling, and maybe that'll change. But yeah, it'll be tough to break in. I already feel like Vulcan, not really super cheap and high cadence vehicle. So yeah, there's SpaceX. There's going to be Blue Origin. I'm confident they're going to launch their New Glenn. How efficient they'll be about it and how cheap, I don't know. That remains to be seen. They don't have a great track record there. Relativity I've talked about previously, but yeah, this is going to be a business of a few companies, and that will be, quite distinguished territory for Rocket Lab to be in, I think, down the line.
We're going to be able to build satellites, so design satellites, build satellites, launch satellites, operate those satellites in orbit, so that ultimately we can have our own assets in orbit. So he said that from the first day, I want my own constellation assets in orbit, and I want to generate recurring revenue from those assets in orbit. And I think we've kind of seen that, the fact that, SpaceX is more than 10 years older than we are, they got there faster than we did. But I think the models they're going to look fairly similar. Now, are we likely to go after, a Starlink-sized kind of constellation. Probably not anytime soon. It'll be a much more targeted application where you would need, whether it's dozens or hundreds of satellites, but probably not tens of thousands of satellites. But ultimately, we're very clear that we will have our own assets on orbit, and we're going to kind of create that next leg of the growth stool off of the application side.
Thought that was very interesting just to hear him say we're probably looking at dozens or hundreds of satellites. They won't be going after Starlink or doing anything similar to how Starlink does things. It'll be completely different and much more targeted, so maybe like a more narrow application, whereas Starlink, I mean, the whole internet really, that's kind of as broad as it gets, I feel like. Always interesting to hear some clues talking about their plans around the constellation.
And there's still elements that we still need, right? So if you look right now, we've got a great bus solution, but where we stop is at the payload side. Mm-hmm. So it's very likely that some of the things that we'll continue to look for to bring in-house are payload capabilities, because those are also things that they could take some time to develop from a greenfield, and so it probably makes more sense and more capital efficient to basically go acquire those things. So those are one of the focus areas. There's still a few more pieces of the bus bomb that we want to get, but then we're incrementally looking more towards the payload. And then, on the application side, those are also areas where we could consider, and we are considering, inorganic ways to enter that market.
Obviously, we've heard all this payload stuff before, but yeah, I really just want to see, the first acquisition happen for payload, because we've been hearing about it for quite a while now.
Well, I think one of the things we've been pretty disciplined about, we don't take on work where we won't just take on work to take on work, right? So we take on work that actually allows us to learn at somebody else's expense. So we love to get paid to learn, right? Yeah. And so as we were developing the capabilities
I love that saying, get paid to learn. That's a great philosophy. Should write that down somewhere.
So the last piece, which is we talked a little bit earlier on the services side. I know you're keeping this one a bit close to the chest because, obviously, don't want to give away too much. But let me frame it, maybe the question a little bit differently in a different context. There's a lot of businesses right now that I have tried to do services, whether it's connectivity or the flavors of that or Earth observation. What is your kind of general view on what's going on right now? Do you think these things are very successful? Do you think there's issues of utilization? How do you think about the services right now, and what are sort of the strengths and weaknesses that you see?
Well, so the applications market...
This is kind of a funny question. It's like, tell me what you like the best, but without actually saying what you're going to do. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what he says.
Is very bifurcated. There's a lot of different verticals, right? And so we look out there and we see successful examples of very successful, potentially successful business models on all of the different verticals, whether it's all the different flavors of Earth observation, right? Because again, you think of Earth observation as one category, but really remote sensing, if you back up, there's a lot of different layers and kind of verticals to that. So I would say that the biggest, if you look at the biggest target with a bullseye on it is comms. It's the biggest market, right? Mm-hmm. But even within comms, there's lots of different things that you can look at within comms, right? There's a lot of new services that are being deployed to consumers, and then there's the enterprise, and then there's the government side of things. So there's lots of capabilities. And so what we're really focused on is, again, how do we get paid to learn to be able to bring these complex solutions to market, that we can use to our own benefit down the road for building our own constellation. So for us, I don't think you can say we're going to be dogmatically, we're going to do one thing and one narrow part of one market. We're going to play across different parts of the market. We're going to place a few bets. And I think the one thing that's attractive to constellation operators about potentially partnering in a very strategic way with Rocket Lab is, if you think about what a constellation operator has to deal with today, they basically have to go out and they have to basically define their spacecraft needs. They have to basically find somebody to build the spacecraft. The spacecraft manufacturer then has to manage all the complexities around a very distributed supply chain. They got to go procure launch. They got to operate the satellites on orbit. They got to manage the end customer dynamic, right? And what we can come in and say, look, we can actually design the spacecraft, manufacture with our own supply chain. We can launch them on our own rockets. We can operate them on orbit. And that really allows the constellation piece of the business to focus on maximizing how to manage the customer and the data, right? And so I think that applies to whether it's Earth observation, communications, experimentation. That applies a lot of different places. But ultimately, we're going to pick an application that we think can have reasonable scale to it. We're not really interested in, tens of millions of dollar kind of lines of business and applications. It's got to be, it's $100 million plus individual chunks of revenue. In some cases, hopefully much, much higher than that.
Yeah, interesting context, very similar to what we heard in that previous interview. Sounds more and more to me like maybe they are interested in partnering with some constellation operator out there and maybe some kind of joint partnership type thing. I don't really know how that would be structured, but could make a lot of sense with what they bring to the table versus what some operators bring to the table. And personally, just from reading between the lines what he's talking about, I've been saying it for, probably a couple years now. I feel like they want to look for some things to do in communications, not in Earth observation. It's just a bigger market. There's more niches within there you can play in. Their biggest satellite customer right now, at least on the commercial side, Globalstar, is communication related as well. So they're getting paid to learn about doing communications already on that side, even if they're not doing the payload piece on those satellite buses. But to me, all signs point to some kind of niche within communication that is not nearly as big as Starlink or directly competing with Starlink.
I would say overall, we did have to push the Neutron program out by about 6 months earlier this year. And I think, that wasn't because we hit a roadblock or we had a technical challenge. It was the fact that it just took longer to gather momentum on the program, because hiring, over the last couple of years has been a difficult thing to do, right? Relatively speaking, compared to other periods. So now we've got that critical mass, and we were able to kind of continue to execute on the plan as we anticipated. So I think now we feel much better. Again, we don't see any glaring technical risks. We don't see any impediments to getting the infrastructure for the pad in place. We largely have a lot of the production infrastructure in place. We're leveraging a lot of the avionics from Electron. A lot of the structural work we're leveraging from Electron with carbon composites. So the real big piece of innovation was around the engine, right? This different architecture for engine versus Rutherford for Electron. And now that we've got successful hot fire, I think we've kind of cracked that nut. So I sleep much better now.
Fantastic.
That's nice to hear. I don't think he's lying about that, clearly. Yeah, there has been a lot of questions lately around the length of the hot fire for Archimedes, and I kind of do believe they haven't gone full duration yet, which is fine, because from what I understand, you generally work your way up, start with short durations and go higher. And from what I heard, they're making some slight upgrades to the next versions from the learnings of that first firing from that first engine, which is what you do when you're testing. So you make upgrades. No big issues there. If you're interested in the progress around Archimedes, I did do a video on that not too long ago where we go through basically all those categories. Not really so much the avionics side of thing, because there's not really as much to see there physically. But yeah, it's definitely interesting, and they do sound confident in the timeline, which is nice to hear.
Fantastic. We're all certainly very excited for that. I'm sure we could chat for much longer, but I want to be mindful of your time, Adam. Thank you so much for joining us.
And from public opinions estimate.
All right, so that's it for the second interview. Thank you guys so much for hanging with me to the end. I hope you found some interesting tidbits in there. Let me know what you thought about what you heard, or if you disagreed with anything I said or had any other takes on what we heard. I'll be interested to check out your comments down below. If you're not already a subscriber, I hope you'll consider hitting that subscribe button. And I hope you have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.